The V-22 Osprey descended through a curtain of shimmering heat, its rotors churning the ochre dust of the Iridian Basin into a blinding storm. Forward, operating base. Arabus was a scar of hardened plascrete and razor wire carved into a landscape that had actively resented life for millennia. It was the bleeding edge of the Coalition's territorial expansion, a place where careers and bodies were broken with equal indifference. From the Osprey's belly ramp, a lone figure descended. She wore simple, slate-gray fatigues devoid of rank or insignia, scuffed boots, and a standard tactical pack that seemed too large for her slight frame. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun, revealing a face that was neither young nor old, etched with lines of fatigue, but not of weakness. Her eyes, a pale, piercing gray, swept over the heat-blasted perimeter, missing nothing. Colonel Marcus Thorne, acting commander of Fob Arabus, watched her approach from the shadow of the command center's entrance. He was a bull of a man, with a jaw that looked like it was hewn from granite and a chest full of metals that gleamed even in the flat, oppressive light. Beside him, Sergeant Kalen Rhino Davies shifted his considerable weight, a smirk playing on his lips. "Is that her?" Rhino rumbled, his voice a low growl of amusement. "The efficiency expert from command? She looks like she'd get lost on the way to the mess hall." Thorne grunted, a sound of profound disapproval. "Another pencil pusher sent to tell us how to fight a war from 1,000 kilometers away. Watch this." The woman stopped a respectful 5 paces from them, her posture relaxed but not subservient. She gave a curt nod. "Colonel Thorne." Her voice was quiet, level, carrying no hint of the arduous journey or the intimidating surroundings. "And you are?" Thorne asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He deliberately kept his arms crossed, a clear breach of military courtesy. "Alara Vance. I'm here for the operational assessment." "Vance," Thorne repeated, tasting the name and finding it bland. "Right, the bean counter. We got the directive." "Frankly, we're a little busy here, Ms. Vance. We have a real fight on our hands. We don't have time to hold your hand and explain why your spreadsheets don't match the reality of incoming mortar fire." Rhino chuckled, a short, sharp bark. Several junior soldiers loitering nearby, drawn by the confrontation, grinned. The air thickened with derision. It was a classic military hazing ritual, the established pack testing a newcomer, especially one who didn't fit the mold. Vance was an outsider, a civilian in all but her functional attire, and here, that was a weakness to be exploited. Vance's expression didn't change. Her gaze remained steady, unnervingly so. "I'm aware of your operational tempo, Colonel. I'll endeavor to stay out of your way." "See, that you do," Thorne said, turning his back on her as if dismissing a servant. "Lieutenant Carter, get over here." A young, eager officer with a fresh haircut and an anxious-to-please demeanor jogged up, snapping a salute. "Sir!" "Carter, this is Vance," Thorne said, waving a dismissive hand in her direction. "She's here from HQ to count our bullets and check our paperwork. Find her a spare cot in the admin block, show her where the latrines are, and make sure she doesn't wander into any real work. Is that understood?" "Sir, yes, sir," Carter said, his eyes flicking nervously toward Vance. He saw a woman of indeterminate age with hands that were calloused and still. He felt a flicker of unease at the colonel's blatant disrespect, but he was too junior, too conditioned to question it. "Good. Rhino, with me, we have actual business to attend to," Thorne boomed, striding into the cool, recycled air of the Command Information Center. Rhino shot Vance a final, contemptuous look, a predator sizing up prey and finding it utterly unimpressive, before following his commander. Left alone with the flustered lieutenant, Vance slung her pack from her shoulder with an easy, practiced motion. "Lead the way, Lieutenant." Carter, trying to regain his professional composure, cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am, this way. The admin block is over here. It's quiet." He meant it as an assurance, a promise that she would be safe from the harsh realities of the base. To Vance, it sounded like an insult, an exile. She followed him across the sun-baked yard, the crunch of her boots on the gravel the only sound she made. The eyes of every soldier she passed lingered on her. They saw the lack of rank, the unassuming build, the quiet demeanor. They saw a bureaucrat, a liability, another piece of high-command foolishness sent to complicate their lives. They saw a target for their scorn, a safe outlet for the constant grinding pressure of their deployment. None of them saw the truth. None of them saw the storm gathering behind those calm, gray eyes. They just saw the new girl. The dismissal solidified over the next 48 hours, hardening from casual contempt into a deliberate, systematic shunning. Colonel Thorne made it his personal mission to marginalize Ilara Vance. During the morning operational briefing, he seated her in a flimsy chair against the back wall, far from the central holographic table where the real decisions were made. "For our guest from command," Thorne announced to the assembled officers, his voice laced with mock generosity. "I'll try to keep the acronyms to a minimum." A ripple of sycophantic laughter went through the room. Thorne gestured to the shimmering tactical display, a 3D map of the sector glowing with friendly and hostile markers. "As you can see, the insurgency has been probing our western perimeter, sectors Gamma and Delta. Standard hit-and-run tactics. Rhino's mechanized platoon has been playing whack-a-mole with them for a week. We maintain absolute kinetic dominance." Vance listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the display. She wasn't looking at the flashing red icons of the enemy probes. She was looking at the gaps between them. She noted the topographical data, the faint energy signatures from deep-range sensors, the subtle atmospheric distortions the local command had dismissed as sensor ghosts. When Thorne paused for effect, she spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the low hum of the command center. "Colonel, what's the status of the Elysium relay, the deep scan seismic sensors?" Thorne's head snapped around. He looked genuinely surprised that she had spoken. "The Elysium relay? That's classified, Miss Vance, and irrelevant. It's a long-range geological survey array. It also monitors subterranean movement and harmonic resonance," Vance stated, not asked. "The pattern of their probes isn't random. It corresponds with the weakest points in the bedrock. They're not testing your fences. They're mapping your foundation." A heavy silence fell over the room. Specialist Anya Sharma, the head intelligence analyst, scoffed audibly from her console. Sharma was sharp, arrogant, and fiercely loyal to Thorne. "With all due respect, ma'am," she said, her tone making it clear she had none, "my team analyzes all source intelligence 24/7. If there were hostiles tunneling under us, we'd know. The seismic data is clean. What you're seeing are echoes from distant artillery drills. Echoes don't form a concentric, inward spiraling pattern," Vance replied calmly. "Run a differential diagnostic. Filter out the surface percussion and amplify anything below 20 meters. Cross-reference it with geological strata maps." Thorne held up a hand, his patience gone. "Enough. Miss Vance, you are an observer. Your job is to observe. My analyst has given you her assessment. We are not going to waste our time and resources chasing geological fantasies while we have real threats on the wire. Is that clear?" Vance simply nodded, her face impassive, and leaned back in her chair. The message was clear. She was to be seen and not heard. The briefing continued, her input discarded as the ramblings of an ignorant civilian. The condescension followed her out of the command center. In the mess hall, she sat alone. Sergeant Rhino and his squad took the table next to her, speaking in deliberately loud voices. "Can you believe it?" Rhino said, stabbing a piece of reconstituted protein with his fork. "She thinks they're giant sandworms gonna pop up and eat the base. Maybe she watched a bad sci-fi flick on the transport over." His men roared with laughter. "Hey, leave her be," another soldier chided with false sympathy. "She's just trying to earn her per diem. Gotta look like you're doing something, right?" "Oh, Colonel, I noticed your foundation is misaligned with the moon's gravitational pull. We should realign the whole base." More laughter. Vance ate her meal methodically, her eyes on her tray. She didn't react, didn't flinch. Her stillness was more unnerving to them than any angry retort would have been. It was as if their words were insects buzzing around a granite statue. They couldn't touch her. This infuriated them more. Her attempts to gather data were met with bureaucratic stonewalling, clearly on Thorne's orders. When she requested access to the raw data feeds from the perimeter defense grid's maintenance logs, the logistics sergeant gave her a patronizing smile. "Sorry, ma'am, that's Tier 5 access only. Colonel's orders. Need to know, and I'm afraid a logistical analyst from command doesn't need to know." She was given a data slate with heavily redacted, surface-level reports. Useless summaries designed to placate a visiting dignitary, not inform a genuine assessment. Every door was politely but firmly closed in her face. She was a ghost haunting the base, present but unseen, her presence tolerated but her purpose actively thwarted. Lieutenant Carter was her reluctant shadow, torn between his orders and a growing sense of unease. He saw how she spent her time. She wasn't in the recreation room or the admin office. He found her on the observation decks, staring out at the desolate landscape for hours, her gaze distant. He saw her at the motor pool, quietly observing the maintenance crews as they worked on the massive armored vehicles, her eyes tracing the power conduits and armor plating. She was learning the base, not from its reports, but from its bones. One evening, he found her at the far end of the landing strip, watching the sky as the twin suns of the system set, painting the clouds in violent shades of purple and orange. A wind was picking up, carrying the fine, gritty dust that got into everything. "Big storm's coming, ma'am," Carter offered, trying to make conversation. "The meteorologists are calling it a Sorocco event. We'll be on lockdown for at least a day. Visibility will be 0. Vance didn't look at him. She looked at the horizon. "The wind provides cover," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Anonymity for sound and movement. Perfect conditions." "Perfect for what, ma'am?" Carter asked, confused. She finally turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in her gray eyes. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a profound, chilling certainty. "For an assault," she said. "When you can't see, you have to rely on your other senses, your technology, your foundation, and theirs is about to crack." Carter felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening chill. He was just a lieutenant following orders. But a part of him, the part that had survived 2 previous deployments, knew that this woman, this quiet, dismissed observer, saw something that they were all missing. And it terrified him. He reported her words to Colonel Thorne, who laughed them off. "Paranoid delusions from a desk jockey," the colonel scoffed. "Let her spook herself. The storm will keep her inside and out of my hair." The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a suffocating whisper. The sky, once a brilliant tapestry of sunset colors, curdled into a solid wall of brownish orange. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the plascrete walls of Fob Arabus. Visibility dropped from kilometers to meters, and then to nothing at all. The world outside the floodlights was an impenetrable, churning vortex of sand. Inside the Command Information Center, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. A base lockdown during a Sorocco was standard procedure. Colonel Thorne stood with his arms crossed, projecting an aura of bored confidence. Specialist Sharma monitored her sensor screens, which were filled with static and false readings from the storm's atmospheric interference. "All perimeter sensors are offline or unreliable, Colonel," Sharma reported. "Too much particulate matter. The microwave barriers are holding, but they're reporting constant phantom trips. It's just the wind." "As expected," Thorne grunted. "Keep the long-range comms array on a tight beam to command. Let them know we're weathering it. Rhino, double the sentries on the wall. Make sure they're tethered." Ilara Vance stood near the back, by the same chair she'd been assigned during the briefing. She hadn't said a word since the lockdown began. She just watched the main holographic display, which now showed little more than a schematic of the base, isolated in a sea of digital noise. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the junior officers. Then it happened. It started with a flicker. The lights in the CIC dimmed for a fraction of a second, then returned. On the main display, a single red icon blinked. Grid power fluctuation, substation 7. "What was that?" Thorne demanded. "Just a surge, sir," the engineering officer reported over the intercom. "The storm is probably playing hell with the external conduits." Vance's eyes narrowed. Substation 7 powered the northern perimeter's automated defense turrets and the Elysium relay. A second icon blinked red. Grid power failure, Substation 7. Then a third and a fourth in rapid succession. Substation 4. Substation 9. "What the hell is going on?" Thorne roared. On the main screen, a cascade of error messages scrolled past, too fast to read. The schematic of the base began to go dark, section by section. The northern perimeter, then the western. The lights in the CIC flickered again, died, and were replaced by the blood-red glow of the emergency backup lighting. The low hum of the base's life support systems fell silent, replaced by the screaming wail of a general alert klaxon. "Sir, we've lost the entire primary power grid," Sharma yelled, her voice tight with panic. "Backup generators are not kicking in. It's a cascading failure." "Impossible," Thorne bellowed. "The systems are redundant, triple redundant." The klaxon sputtered and died, plunging the command center into an eerie, near-total silence, broken only by the muffled howl of the storm and the frantic breathing of the staff. And in that silence a new sound began. A deep, rhythmic thumping from far below their feet. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of heavy machinery, not theirs, boring its way through solid rock. Vance's prediction. The emergency comm channel crackled to life. It was Rhino, his voice strained, almost unrecognizable. "Command, this is Rhino. We have contact. Western Gate. They're coming out of the ground. I repeat, they are coming out of the ground, heavy armor." Simultaneously, another voice, high with terror, screamed over the local channel from the northern wall. "Mortars, incoming! They're walking them right down the perimeter. Our turrets are dead. We have no defenses." The crisis was absolute. The base was blind, powerless, and being attacked from multiple, unforeseen directions. The enemy hadn't just used the storm for cover. They had used it to mask a sophisticated, synchronized assault designed to exploit the very weakness Vance had identified. Chaos erupted in the CIC. Officers shouted for status reports that didn't exist. Sharma frantically tried to reboot her console, which remained stubbornly dark. Thorn, his face pale in the red emergency light, stared at the dead holographic table, as if he could will it back to life. His entire strategy, his belief in kinetic dominance and technological superiority, had been shattered in less than 90 seconds. He was a commander without eyes, ears, or weapons. "Get me a runner to the motor pool. Tell them to get every vehicle started," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Sharma, get me a hardline to Sector Command. I don't care how. Do it." His orders were born of desperation, reactions to a situation he no longer controlled. He was trying to plug a dozen holes in a dam that had already burst. Through it all, Ilara Vance remained perfectly still. The thumping from below, the distant crump of mortar fire, the panicked shouts, none of it seemed to touch her. She was the eye of the hurricane, a pocket of absolute calm in a vortex of fear and confusion. She had seen this before. She had planned for it. She had lived it. She took a slow breath, her mind a cold, clear engine of calculation. The enemy had disabled the power grid, likely with a targeted EMP or a subterranean sabotage team. They were using the tunnels to bypass the main defenses and deploy armor at the weakest structural point, the western gate. The mortars were suppressing the northern wall, preventing reinforcement. It was a classic siege break, maneuver, brilliant and deadly. Thorn was losing control. His command structure had collapsed with his technology. His people were looking to him for answers, and he had none. Vance began to move. Her first steps were quiet, almost unnoticed in the pandemonium. She walked not to Thorn, but to a dusty, forgotten panel on the far wall labeled Auxiliary Environment Control and Manual Override. It was an old system, a relic from the base's initial construction, long since superseded by the integrated digital grid. Most of the junior staff didn't even know what it was. She pulled a small multifaceted tool from a pocket in her fatigues. Her fingers, nimble and sure, unfastened the panel's security bolts. Inside was a tangle of thick, bundled cables and a series of heavy mechanical switches. Lieutenant Carter, who had been trying uselessly to get a signal on his personal data slate, saw her. "Ma'am, what are you doing? That hasn't been used in years." "The digital grid is compromised," Vance said without looking at him, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. "The enemy is inside our network, but they won't be looking for this." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, pulling a specific red cable and slamming it into a different port. She threw a heavy copper switch. It clanked into place with a sound of finality. A low hum filled the room, and a single bank of fluorescent lights flickered on overhead, casting a harsh, sterile white light. On a small, outdated monitor above the panel, green text began to scroll. Manual power routing. Activated. Source: Geothermal reserve tap. Target: CIC hardline Combs. Perimeter lighting. Sector Beta. "I have lights on the south wall," a voice yelled over the comm. "And is that a comm line?" Sharma stared at her console, which had just flickered to life, showing a single, bare-bones command prompt. "I have a hardline. It's isolated, point-to-point only, but it's active." Thorn spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. He stared at Vance, who was already moving to her next task. "How did you—" "The geothermal tap is on a separate shielded circuit," Vance explained, her tone that of a lecturer explaining a simple principle. "It's inefficient, which is why it was decommissioned. But it's also physically disconnected from the main grid. It can't be hacked." She looked at Sharma. "Get a message to command. Use burst transmission, encrypted. Code it Scythefall. Tell them Fob Arabus is under siege by a technologically superior force. We have been compromised from within and below. Request immediate QRF, but advise them our landing zone is contested. They'll understand." Sharma, stunned into obedience, began typing furiously. The code name, the precise economical language. It was the vernacular of high-level special operations, not a logistical analyst. Vance then turned to Thorne, her gray eyes locking with his for the first time. The dismissal was gone from her gaze, replaced by an intensity that made the colonel flinch. "Colonel," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute authority, "your strategy is failing. You're trying to fight a ghost you can't see. Stop reacting. Start dictating." "You are out of line," Thorne sputtered, his authority threatened. "Your men are dying," Vance countered, her voice like ice. "The enemy expects you to rally at the western gate, to throw your men into a prepared killing field. They are using the mortars in the north to pin your reserves. It's a classic pincer, but their real target isn't the gate." She pointed to the old static schematic on the wall. "It's here, the central command node, this building. The tunnels aren't just for their armor. They have infiltration teams. They've been under our feet this entire time." As if on cue, a new sound joined the cacophony from outside. The sharp, distinct crack of rifle fire, shockingly close, from the corridor leading to the CIC. The CIC staff froze. The enemy wasn't at the gates, they were here. Before anyone else could react, Vance moved with a speed that was utterly incongruous with her unassuming appearance. She grabbed the rifle from the trembling hands of a young guard by the door, checked the action, and flipped the selector to semi-automatic in a single, fluid motion. "Carter!" she snapped. The young lieutenant, startled, straightened up. "Barricade that door, now! Use the server racks! Everyone else, get down and get behind cover!" Her voice wasn't a shout, it was a blade. It cut through the panic and demanded obedience. The staff, including a shocked specialist Sharma, scrambled for cover behind consoles and desks. Thorne stood frozen for a second, his mind struggling to process the complete inversion of the command structure. This woman, this bureaucrat, was now commanding his CIC. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets stitched across the reinforced door, sending sparks and plascrete dust into the room. Vance didn't flinch. She took a position beside the door frame, the rifle held with the easy familiarity of a master craftsman holding their favorite tool. She was no longer just calm, she was focused, a predator in her element. She breathed out slowly, her heart rate steady. "They'll breach in 3, 2, 1. The door exploded inward, blown off its hinges by a shaped charge. Through the smoke and debris, 3 figures in sleek black armor stormed in, their weapons raised. They never got a second shot off. Vance fired 3 times. Pop, pop, pop. 3 precise, economical shots. The first 2 infiltrators dropped instantly, single holes appearing in their helmets' visors. The third, a larger man, staggered back, his weapon clattering to the floor as a round took him in the throat, just above his body armor. He collapsed, gurgling. Silence. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 seconds. Vance lowered the rifle, her eyes already scanning the corridor beyond. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and ozone. She ejected the spent magazine and smoothly slotted a fresh one from the fallen guard's belt, all without looking down. The CIC staff stared, their minds reeling. They had just witnessed a level of lethal proficiency that most of them had only seen in training simulations. Rhino Davies, who prided himself on being the toughest man on the base, had seen combat up close, but nothing like this. This was not a soldier fighting. This was an executioner at work. Vance turned back to the room. Her eyes fell on Thorne, who was leaning against the far wall, his face ashen. "Colonel," she said, her voice devoid of any triumph or emotion, "the internal threat is neutralized for now. But more will come. We need to re-establish control. I need you to get on that comm and rally your men. They need to hear their commander's voice. Tell them to hold their positions, conserve ammunition, and await your orders. Do not let them break." Her words were a command, but also an offering. She was giving him a chance to reclaim his role, to do the one thing he was still capable of doing, leading his men. Thorne, humbled and shaken to his core, looked at the dead infiltrators, then at the woman holding the rifle. The contempt, the arrogance, it had all been burned away, replaced by a raw, dawning awe. He nodded slowly, then moved to the comm station Sharma had activated. Vance turned her attention to the holographic table. It was still dead. "Carter, where is the primary nexus for the base's internal sensor network? Not the perimeter, the internal, life support, motion detectors, pressure plates." "The sub-level, ma'am," Carter stammered, pointing a trembling finger at a floor hatch. "Server room C, but it's offline." "It won't be for long," Vance said, handing the rifle to Carter. "Keep this door covered. Shoot anything that isn't one of us." She strode to the hatch, pried it open, and descended into the darkness below without a moment's hesitation. The remaining staff in the CIC could only watch, their world turned upside down. The pencil pusher, the bean counter they had mocked, was now their only hope, and she was descending into the bowels of the base to fight a war they hadn't even known had begun. The aftermath of the battle was a landscape of surreal stillness. The Sorocco had blown itself out just before dawn, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. The rising sun cast long, dark shadows from the husks of burned-out enemy vehicles near the western gate and illuminated the pockmarks from mortar fire along the northern wall. The air tasted of dust and smoke. Fob Arabus had held just. The final hours of the fight had been a blur of desperate, close-quarters combat. Guided by Vance's quiet, precise instructions from the reactivated internal sensors, Thorne's soldiers had methodically hunted down the remaining infiltration teams. Rhino's platoon, instead of being annihilated at the gate, had been redirected through service tunnels to flank the enemy's armored column from behind, turning a certain slaughter into a decisive ambush. The base's survival had been bought with blood, but the cost was far lower than it should have been. Every soldier on the base knew why. They owed their lives to the quiet woman. In the wrecked Command Information Center, a fragile order was being restored. Medics moved among the wounded. Engineers worked frantically to restore full power. And Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before a now functioning terminal, his face grim. The battle was over, but his own personal reckoning had just begun. He needed to know who Alara Vance was. His authority, his very career, depended on it. With his override codes, he accessed the High Command personnel files, a breach of protocol he no longer cared about. He typed in her name, Vance Ilara. The file that appeared on the screen made him physically recoil. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. Vance Ilara, 010. General, Coalition Special Operations Command. Status, active, covert. Current assignment. Commander, Sector Gamma. Includes Fob Arabus. Call sign, Nix. Below the heading was a service record that read like a classified history of the past 30 years of warfare. Operation Silent Aegis, the Black Reef Incursion, the Siege of Cygnus X1. Campaigns and operations so secret that Thorne had only ever heard of them in hushed rumors. The list of commendations was longer than his entire service record. It was filled with awards for valor, for strategic genius, for actions taken deep behind enemy lines, alone. Specialist Sharma, working at a nearby console, saw the look on her commander's face. Curiosity overriding protocol, she angled her screen and ran the same search. Her sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. "Nix," she whispered, the name spoken with a reverence usually reserved for myths. Nix was a legend in the intelligence community, a ghost, the architect of the coalition's most impossible victories, a commander who had never lost a theater of war, who personally vetted every deep-cover operation. Nix was said to be able to see the shape of a battle before the first shot was fired. They had been mocking a living legend. The realization spread through the CIC like a shockwave. Lieutenant Carter, his face smudged with grime and a fresh dressing on his arm, saw the file over Sharma's shoulder. His blood ran cold. He remembered his fumbling attempts to babysit her. He remembered offering her directions to the latrine. The news traveled faster than a radio transmission. It didn't need to be broadcast. It was carried in the wide-eyed stares, the hushed whispers, the sudden, profound silence that fell over any group of soldiers when the woman in the plain gray fatigues walked past. Sergeant Rhino Davies heard it from one of his men while they were securing the breach at the western gate. He looked at the mangled enemy tank he had destroyed from the flank. A kill he only made because of a last-minute, insane-sounding order to redeploy. An order that had come from her. He felt a hot wave of shame wash over him, so intense it was dizzying. He thought of his jokes in the mess hall, his loud, arrogant dismissal of her. He felt like the smallest, most foolish man in the universe. The respect, when it came, was not loud or ostentatious. It was deep, silent, and absolute. It was a change in the very atmosphere of Fob Arabus. When Vance emerged from the sublevels, her fatigues stained with grease and her face etched with exhaustion, the frantic activity in the CIC came to a dead stop. Every officer, every analyst, every soldier turned to face her. In unison, they straightened their postures. It wasn't a formal command, but a spontaneous, instinctual reaction. Colonel Thorne walked forward to meet her. He was no longer the proud, belligerent bull. He was humbled, his face a mask of contrition. He stopped 3 paces from her and executed the sharpest, most perfect salute of his life. His back was ramrod straight, his eyes locked forward. "General Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Fob Arabus is secure. Damage reports are being compiled. I await your orders." He didn't apologize. An apology would have been an insult, an attempt to lessen his own gross failure of judgment. This was the only thing he could offer, his complete and unconditional submission to her command. Vance looked at him, her gray eyes holding no trace of triumph or vindication. She simply saw a soldier who had been broken and was now ready to be remade. She returned his salute with a crisp, economical motion. "Your report, Colonel," she said. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a signal that the work continued. From across the room, Specialist Sharma stood. "General," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I ran the differential diagnostic you requested on the deep scan seismic data." She brought up an image on the main holographic display. It showed a complex network of tunnels beneath the base, far more extensive than the one the enemy had used. "You were right, they were mapping us. This was just the first wave. They were preparing to move an entire battalion underground." Vance nodded slowly, her eyes on the display. "They still are. The fight isn't over. It's just begun." Lieutenant Carter approached, holding out a fresh water canteen. He didn't say a word, just offered it to her, his eyes filled with a level of hero worship that made her uncomfortable. She took it, drank deeply, and handed it back with a small nod of thanks. As she moved through the base to inspect the damage, the reaction was the same everywhere. Soldiers stopped what they were doing, tending to the wounded, clearing debris, repairing equipment, and simply watched her pass. Some saluted. Others just stood a little straighter. The mockery had been replaced by a quiet, profound awe. They were in the presence of something they had never thought they would see. Rhino Davies saw her approaching the western gate. He barked at his men to come to attention. As she drew level, he stepped forward. He was a giant of a man, covered in dust and dried blood, but he seemed to shrink before her. He couldn't bring himself to salute. Instead, he did what felt more honest. He ducked his head in a short, powerful nod. It was a gesture of fealty, a warrior's acknowledgement of a superior. Vance met his gaze, held it for a moment, and gave a slight nod in return. It was all that was needed. The message was passed. Respect, earned in fire and blood, had been given and received. The sun was high in the sky now, baking the scarred plascrete of the base. The immediate crisis was over, but the war for Arabus was just starting. Yet, for the first time, the soldiers felt not fear, but a grim sense of purpose. The pencil pusher was gone. In her place stood General Nix, and where she led, they would follow into hell itself. Dawn broke on the third day after the assault, a clean, sterile light that promised nothing but more heat. The frantic energy of repair had given way to a methodical, grinding rhythm of fortification. Fob Arabus was no longer a complacent outpost. It was a fortress preparing for a siege. Elara Vance stood on the command center's highest observation deck, a place she had stood in anonymity only days before. The wind was calm, and the vast ochre desert stretched to an infinite horizon. She held a steaming mug of black coffee in her calloused hands, the warmth a small, grounding comfort. She had not slept. There hadn't been time. The base below moved with a new kind of efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no loud shouting. Orders were given quietly and followed instantly. Teams of engineers, overseen by a newly focused Lieutenant Carter, were reinforcing the subterranean levels, laying seismic charges and rerouting power through shielded conduits, following schematics Vance had sketched on a data slate from memory. Specialist Sharma's intelligence analysts worked in relentless shifts, no longer dismissing sensor ghosts but hunting them, cross-referencing every flicker of data with the General's tactical projections. Colonel Thorne had become her executive officer in fact, if not yet in title. He was a changed man. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind the competent professional soldier he had been before pride had blinded him. He translated Vance's strategic directives into actionable orders for the line companies, his voice now calm and measured over the comms. He anticipated her needs, marshaled the resources, and managed the personnel with a quiet competence that spoke of a man redeemed. He never made eye contact with her for more than a second, but in that second his deference was absolute. Sergeant Rhino Davies and his platoon, once the loudest and most boisterous on the base, were now the quietest. They had been tasked with hunter-killer patrols in the newly mapped tunnel systems beneath the base. It was claustrophobic, terrifying work, but they did it without complaint. They had seen what the General could do, and they trusted her implicitly. Their trust was their shield in the darkness below. Vance took a slow sip of her coffee. She wasn't looking at the flurry of activity. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the unseen enemy. She was thinking, processing, running 1,000 silent simulations in her mind. The first assault had been a test, a violent, brilliant probe to gauge their strength and weaknesses. They had failed the test, and she had saved them. The next one would be different. The enemy now knew they were not facing a complacent garrison commanded by a fool. They were facing Nix. They would adapt, They would be more cunning, more brutal. The door to the observation deck hissed open. It was Carter, looking exhausted but energized. He carried a data slate. "General," he said, his voice crisp. He no longer stammered in her presence. He had found his footing in the new reality. "First light drone reconnaissance is complete. We've found them, or at least where they're massing." He handed her the slate. It showed a thermal image of a series of deep ravines, 20 kilometers to the east. The heat signatures indicated a massive force, shielded from orbital surveillance by the canyon's overhangs. "They're larger than we anticipated," Carter said quietly. "Division strength, at least, with heavy siege equipment." Vance studied the image, her expression unreadable. She traced a faint line on the screen with her finger, a geological fault line that Sharma's team had highlighted. It ran from the ravine directly toward the base. "They've stopped trying to be subtle," she murmured. "This won't be an infiltration. It will be a full frontal assault. They'll use the fault line to shatter our foundations and roll over us with sheer force. We can't hold against that, ma'am," Carter said, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to suppress. "Not even with the new fortifications. Our relief fleet is still 3 days out." "We won't have to hold," Vance said. She set her mug down on the railing. "We won't be here." Carter stared at her, confused. "Ma'am?" "They expect us to dig in, to cower behind our walls and wait for an orbital bombardment to save us, to fight a defensive war. It's what Thorne would have done." She turned to face him, and for a fleeting moment he saw a flicker of something that looked like a grim smile in her eyes. "But they are not fighting Colonel Thorne anymore. They are fighting me." She handed the slate back to him. "Lieutenant, tell Colonel Thorne to prep every combat-capable vehicle for immediate departure. Ammunition, fuel, and water only. We're stripping the base. Tell Sergeant Davies to pull his teams from the tunnels and rig them with every explosive we have. He'll know the critical structural points to target. Specialist Sharma is to wipe all sensitive data from the mainframes and prepare a single, repeating broadcast loop. Something simple. A welcome message." Carter's mind raced, trying to comprehend the audacity of her plan. You're abandoning the base? A base is a tool, Lieutenant. Nothing more. This one has been compromised, so we will discard it." Her gaze went back to the horizon, to the hidden enemy army. "They want a fortress to smash. We're going to give them one. And then, when they are inside, celebrating their great victory, Sergeant Davies will turn their prize into their tomb." "And us?" Carter asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We," General Vance said, picking up her coffee mug, "are going hunting." There was no ceremony, no final salute. Just the quiet, efficient exodus of a predator leaving its lair. As the last vehicle rolled out of the gates of Fob Arabus, turning not away from the enemy but towards their flank, Vance took one last look back at the empty fortress. It stood silent under the morning sun, a perfect, tempting target. She had arrived as a joke, an object of scorn. She was leaving as a legend reborn, leading the men who had once mocked her into a battle they could not possibly win, but one from which they would not flinch. The sun glinted off the dusty hull of her command vehicle. The work was not over. It was never over. But here, in the vast unforgiving emptiness of the Iridian Basin, she was exactly where she belonged. The general was home.